By late May 1968, the Beatles had returned to England from Rishikesh. In their quest for inner peace, they'd returned very different people. They stopped caring so much about fashionable clothing, replaced their witty humour for a more serious, melancholy attitude, and cared very little about working together as a unit. This of course all came out in their music. They were now due to start recording sessions for their next album, an album they would never agree on a title for. Paul later referred to it as the Tension album. It would be known as the White Album. In the summer of '68, the youth were looking to musicians for spiritual and political advice. So involved with music, messages were ciphered from album covers, records were spammed backwards, lyrics were dissected for hidden messages.
And when I played it backwards and spun it backwards, it said, "Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man." Whew. I freaked.
The White Album was the first of the Beatles records which seemingly fed into this fanaticism, with lyrics like, "Here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul," and "In their lives there's something lacking, what they need's damn good whacking." In reality, they were just mixing up poetry and nonsense which was being misinterpreted. The songs recorded didn't merge together as one, and the finished product was ultimately a collection of solo recordings. On release, the Beatles were slated as not as adventurous as Pepper by some critics, and far more imaginative than Pepper by others. This is the story of the White Album. In January of 1968, the Beatles had started a company called Apple and decided to manage themselves after the death of Brian Epstein. The reason I diverged to Apple is the company was the catalyst to many arguments between the four, ultimately driving them in four separate directions. The only reason they'd started the company is their accountant had told them they had $2 million they could either lose in tax or invest in a company. In hindsight, maybe the former would have been the wiser decision. Not only would they shell out more money into Apple, it was a distraction from the only thing that mattered, their music. The White Album sessions marked the first time the Beatles brought their personal problems into their work life. Those at EMI, until that point, knew nothing of their private lives. Disagreements they were having in Apple meetings began to spill over into the sessions. But not just that, Paul and George began disagreeing on the structure of songs. Paul also began watching Ringo closely and critiquing his drumming, and John began bringing his girlfriend into the sessions. If all this wasn't difficult enough, EMI had just employed a new studio engineer called Alan Stagg. Stagg, according to engineer Jeff Emmerich, was a nightmare and a power freak. Clueless, arrogant and rude. One time when Stagg was working with Pink Floyd in Studio 3, he turned the power off during a session because they were working past the closing time of 10 o'clock. He installed fabrics and sheets into Studio 1 because he didn't like the sound. Emmerich believed he destroyed the acoustics. On his first day arriving at Abbey Road, Stagg called everyone into Studio 1 and basically told them if they didn't follow his direction, there's the door. Bear in mind, there were people who'd been working in Abbey Road for 30 or 40 years being told by a man on his first day. One of the biggest problems with Stagg was he was of the opinion anyone was replaceable. No engineer was unique, and so Stagg's mantra became, if you don't like it, leave. Engineers at this time at Abbey Road recorded consistently with the same bands. It was comfortable for everyone. Stagg juggled them around just for the sake of it. Maybe he didn't understand this, but most likely he just didn't care. He was exercising his power. Later in 1969, Stagg would resign after the staff got together in EMI and complained. But for now, everything was ripe for the perfect storm. In May, the Beatles meet at George's bungalow to record demos for their next album. They record on George's Apex reel-to-reel tape recorder. 27 songs are recorded. It is suspected, however, John and Paul brought over songs they recorded at their individual homes as they had tape recorders too. The group sit in George's living room playing each song amongst a cloud of joss stick smoke. They will struggle to replicate this relaxed atmosphere later in Abbey Road. When everything is recorded, George mixes all the songs himself and gives the finished product to each 4 Beatles. These 27 demo tapes later become known as the White Album Unplugged. The tapes were leaked and later sold as the Kim Thorne's demos. Some of these demos, like Blackbird and Julia, will appear in the album in acoustic form played solo. In the time it takes to record all of these songs in the studio, they will have written more to feature on the album. The sessions begin May 30th in Studio 2, George Martin as producer and engineers Geoff Emerick and Phil MacDonald. By this point, it's currently in the newspapers John and George have left Rishikesh due to the Maharishi's advances towards a young woman. This day, John is in a noticeably bad mood, and when asked how India was, Lennon responds, "It was okay, apart from that nasty little Maharishi." George, who's listening, interjects, "Oh come on, he wasn't that bad." Ringo then adds, "It was like a Butlins holiday camp, only the food wasn't as good." As for Paul, he says nothing about India, just stares expressionless. One thing is for sure, their time in India had left a bitter taste in their mouth, so to speak. It had been George's idea to go to India, and when they returned, he wrote the song Not Guilty, basically saying, "Don't blame me for what happened." That day, they begin talking about John's new guru, a former television repairman who boasted of being able to create incredible things, such as paint that turns anything invisible and X-ray glasses that see through walls. He'd been nicknamed Magic Alex. John was fascinated with technology, but also clueless about it. He ate up everything Magic Alex was telling him. Alex had been introduced to the other Beatles when he came along to the Magical Mystery Tour sessions. He soon got acquainted with the others and was invited out on the Mystery Tour bus. He can even be seen featuring in their film. While in the studio, Alex had a good look at the equipment and decided he could invent something way more advanced. He could design machines the size of an oven to the size of a matchbox. The 4 all bought into it. Throughout the whole of the White Album sessions, the 4 would be second guessing their engineers. They would state, "Alex says it doesn't have to be done this way, you can do it this way." The engineers became very skeptical of Magic Alex's extraordinary claims, especially one day when he was found underneath the mixing console in Studio 2 with a flashlight trying to figure out how it worked. The engineers reported Alex to Stag, but nothing happened. He'd been given permission by the Beatles. Alex had told the 4 he needed to examine all the equipment. George Martin, for one, knew he was a fraud. He knew Alex had no clue of how to design these ridiculous inventions. Sometimes he'd take Alex to the side and ask, "How are you going to do that?" He'd never come up with a plausible method. He'd even begin talking in broken English, acting as if he didn't have a grasp of the language. He'd be talking complete gibberish, and if John was present, he'd pretend he could understand him and agree. As the sessions begin, the first song they record is Revolution 1. The Beatles decide on a new method of working. Possibly in an attempt to mimic the relaxed atmosphere at George's bungalow, they will rehearse every song over and over, with each rehearsal being recorded. Midway through recording that day, John turns his amp up to a deafening level. He was playing so loud, the noise was being picked up by other microphones. George Martin refused to confront him and sent an engineer down to do it. When engineer Geoff Emerick approached Lennon, Lennon explained the reason he had his amp so high is because he was trying to distort the shit out of his guitar. He explained he'd turn his guitar down, but they'd have to create a distortion effect on his guitar when mixing. As Emerick walked away, John snapped at him to get his act together. In the control room, they created an effect they used previously with John's voice on I Am the Walrus. Instead of it being on his voice, they just used it on his guitar. They got the desired sound, but John was angered that it took them so long. As the session went on, John's anger grew worse and worse. By the end, he was going berserk. Some of the engineers had never seen him like this, and most likely it was down to the side effects of the drugs he was taking. John pushed the band through take after take until his voice was gone. Then he declared, "Okay, I've had enough." After that, They all climbed the stairs and listened to what they had in the control room. The next day, sessions began with the 3 Beatles minus John waiting in Studio 2 and the 2 engineers with George Martin talking quietly in the control room. Arriving late, John burst through the control room door. Behind him followed a small Japanese woman carrying a camera. She would, by the way, never take any photos of this day. She stayed in the control room while John headed down to Studio 2. All of a sudden, John burst back in and stated, "This is Yoko," then exited again. Yoko sat in the control room for hours. Everyone in there felt uncomfortable. She sat right in front of the window, so the engineers and George Martin had to lean over to see the Beatles. Though, to be honest, Studio 2 was so dimly lit, George and the engineers could barely see them anyway. Eventually, John came up to the control room and took her down to Studio 2. When she'd left the room, George Martin stated, "What on earth is John thinking?" Down in Studio 2, the other Beatles ignored her. She sat next to John, and from that point on, they were, as George Harrison said, never to be seen apart again. Yoko was at John's side everywhere. She even came to the toilet with him, waiting outside and sitting on the floor. Though they were together constantly, strangely, they barely spoke a word to each other. A few days later, while they were listening back to a song in the control room, John asked Yoko what she thought. She told him it was pretty good, but should be played faster. There was complete silence. Everyone, even John, looked shocked. They completely ignored her and carried on talking. Paul would have especially been annoyed. According to the engineers, he never handled criticism well from anyone except John and possibly George. As the sessions went on, John's behaviour became more bizarre. He asked an engineer to record his vocals with him lying flat on the floor. He also hated singing into the microphones and asked why the microphone had to be in front of him rather than behind him. Behind their back, the engineers talked about how drugged out the Beatles had become. By June 5th, they'd finished recordings on Revolution 1. They then started on Ringo's song Don't Pass Me By. He'd actually written the song himself, as opposed to being given one John and Paul had written. That day, DJ Kenny Everett came to the studio and did an interview with them during the recording. June 11th, Paul records Blackbird alone on his acoustic guitar while George and Ringo are over in the States and John is in another studio working on Revolution 9. Video was used of Paul for an Apple promo. At the time, Paul had brought a girl into the studio, perhaps as a retort to John bringing in Yoko. Paul requested Blackbird sound like he was singing it outdoors, so they decided just to go outdoors and record him. A few of the birds that can be heard on the record were actual birds outside, but mainly they were overdubbed later. During the sessions on June 20th, neither Paul or Ringo were present. John books out Studios 1, 2 and 3 at Abbey Road, and in doing so finishes off Revolution 9. The track was a half Yoko, half Lennon production. John is over the moon with the song. He feels this is how the Beatles should now sound going forward. When Paul arrives back, John plays him Revolution 9. He barely has any reaction to the song. He just mutters, "Not bad." Basically, he was saying he didn't like it without saying he didn't like it. Lennon knew this and snapped, "Not bad? You have no idea what you're talking about. This should be our next bloody single. This is the direction the Beatles should be going in from now on." Yoko added, "I agree, I think it's great," she now feeling like a part of the band. Paul and John would later get into an argument about whether Revolution 9 should even be on the album. The next session on June 27th, they begin work on another John song, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey. John and George had their guitars blasting so loud it drowned out Paul's bass completely. After trying to compete with them, Paul dropped his bass and began ringing a fireman's bell. He wasn't mic'd, but the noise bled through to John and George's mics. Paul later overdubbed his bass onto the track. For the next session, John bought a soft ballad he'd written called Good Night. For the song, he wanted Ringo to sing lead vocal. The finished product sounds like something off My Fair Lady. Personally, I'd like to have heard John singing it. John had in fact written it as a lullaby for his son Julian. No Beatles instrumentation is featured on Good Night. By the 3rd of July, they begin recording Paul's song Obla Di Obla Da. John hated it from the get-go. He called it more of Paul's granny music. They worked on the song with Paul struggling for a reggae sound. John half the time enthusiastic and half the time disinterested. After working continuously on the song for 5 days, Paul decided he was going to scrap everything and start from fresh. John went berserk and stormed out of the studio. He reappeared in the studio hours later, heavily intoxicated, and declared, "This is how the fucking song should go," before hammering out the intro on the piano. The next day, still not happy, Paul decides to rewrite the rewritten version. He soon gives up, deciding the song can't be bettered. Side note, engineer Geoff Emerick records sometimes they would bring in songs, rehearse them endlessly, sometimes they would get better and sometimes they would get worse. He remembered how frustrating it was to listen to them get more intoxicated and hear their songs go downhill. The Beatles also put screens up, creating private areas of Studio 2 in which the studio engineers couldn't see what they were doing. They would smoke marijuana behind the screens and light joss sticks in an attempt to hide the smell. Obviously, it didn't work, and every engineer knew exactly what they were doing. It is worth noting, at this point in their career, the group were directionless. Paul, who'd stepped forward to lead the group during Pepper and the Magical Mystery Tour, was now doing his own thing. John would have loved to have led the group, but he was too impatient and unfocused at this point. The structure they'd always followed began to break down. An example of this is they demanded to hear the playback down in Studio 2 because they couldn't be bothered to walk up the 20 stairs to the control room. They also grew resentful of the engineers, who worked endlessly and had to put up with a terrible atmosphere. Nobody, at this point, wanted the job of the Beatles sound engineer. At this point, Yoko and John were eating a macrobiotic diet, and the smell of George's Indian curries filled Studio 2. You may have noticed a pattern forming with John's playing. For every song, he had his amp settings on full blast. He was at this point very agitated, and it all came out through his guitar. Every session, he wanted his guitar louder and louder. For the engineers, it was a nightmare. There is a limitation as to how loud you can go before the guitar sounds a mess. This frustrated John, maybe because Magic Alex was in his ear telling him it was all nonsense, and in the new Apple studio he'd be able to play as loud as he wanted. One day Lennon demanded a dirtier sound on his guitar, and engineer Geoff Emerick began messing around with the controls on the console, literally risking blowing up the board to appease John. In fact, John was trying to achieve a raw sound in response to Pepper, which had a polished sound. John hated Pepper. At the time, he called it the biggest load of shit we've ever done. Though this could have been a passive aggressive shot at Paul, John was forever in competition with Paul. Over the weekend, John and Paul take home mixed copies of Obla Di Obla Da and Revolution to listen to. Neither one are happy, and they return Monday to remix and change lead vocals. By this point, the tension in the studio had become unbearable. While Paul's adding a new vocal to Obla Di Obla Da, George Martin asked him to change the phrasing on the last verse. Paul snapped, "If you think you can do it better, why don't you come down here and sing it yourself?" George Martin was enraged. He shouted back, "Then bloody sing it. I give up. I just don't know any better how to help you." It was the first time George Martin had raised his voice in a recording session. Paul calmed down after a while, and they started work on John's song Cry Baby Cry. The next day on the 16th of July, they continued work on John's song. They were now arguing amongst themselves, and with the worsening atmosphere in the studio, their longtime engineer Geoff Emerick reached his breaking point and quit midway through the song. Lennon attempted to stop him leaving, to no avail. 19th of July, recording for Sexy Sadie begins. Through 21 takes, they try to figure out an arrangement. Listening back afterwards, John is displeased and nothing is used. At this time, the rock group Family released their album Music in a Doll's House. This forces the Beatles to scrap their title, A Doll's House. They go through with Plan B, which was to simply title the album The Beatles. Following this, recordings for Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey are complete. For the song, John tells the engineers he wants his voice to sound like somebody from the moon. July 24th, work continues on Sexy Sadie. Despite 23 takes, John is still not happy. The song is put aside for later. By this point, George had patiently been waiting to record his songs. They begin recording his first of 5, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The first take was the well-known acoustic version before more instruments would be added later on. When the session is over, George takes the tapes to listen to them at home. Over the weekend, Paul works on his latest song and their next single, Hey Jude. John is currently living at Paul's St. John's Wood home with Yoko. On Monday they begin work on Hey Jude that lasts 4 days. Paul and George argue on the arrangement, with George wanting to add a guitar after each verse. August 7th, work begins on George's second song, Not Guilty. George decides to record his guitar in the control room with the speakers blasting because he wants it to feel like he's performing live. The sessions go on for days with over 100 takes. At the end, George is not pleased and the song is scrapped. George would later use this song on one of his solo albums. Following this, John continues remakes of Sexy Sadie, attempting to get a sound he's happy with. Sessions also continue with Yeah Blues and a John and Yoko composition, What's the New Mary Jane. The next day, Paul's song Rocky Raccoon is recorded. It was difficult for Paul because the whole thing had to be done in one take, with the quirkiness of the vocals not being possible to edit with multiple takes. The song is completed in one 8-hour session. August 16th, the arrangement is changed on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. More instruments are added and more vocal effects. A day later, George decides to travel to Greece. This day, Paul completes his acoustic song, Mother Nature's Son. By this point, the Beatles were arguing so much they'd send the engineers out the studio saying either go for a drink or go for a meal, so they didn't have spectators watching. Ringo was particularly annoyed. Before the sessions would begin, he'd be waiting for everyone to arrive in reception, sometimes for hours. One time he got tired of waiting and went home. George Martin also told engineers he was having problems with Ringo. Paul was standing in to play drums anytime he wasn't there. Things came to a head when they recorded their next song back in the USSR. Paul had been criticising Ringo's drumming, and that day he wasn't in a good mood. Ringo later stated he felt he wasn't playing great and he felt like an outsider, so he left the band. While at home, the group sent him postcards reassuring him and begging him to come back. 28th of August, recordings for Dear Prudence begin. Ringo is still not back by this point, so Paul plays drums. The other Beatles work on the track for 3 days before continuing While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Ringo returns and adds maracas to the track. George is unhappy with the work, scraps the whole song and then starts again. John and Paul have been paying little attention while recording and George is annoyed with them both. George at this point asks Eric Clapton to play guitar on the track. September 4th, promo videos for Hey Jude and Revolution are shot at Twickenham Studios. At this point, George Martin goes on holiday and asks another engineer, Chris Thomas, to take over. Thomas begins work the day they are recording Paul's track, Helter Skelter. When Paul arrives, he sees Thomas and states, "What are you doing here?" Thomas replies, "George has suggested I come and help." Paul then states, Well, if you want to produce us, you can produce us. If you don't, we might just tell you to fuck off. In fact, Thomas didn't really do much production. Through September, the Beatles would produce their own tracks. Side note, one day Paul brought his sheepdog Martha into Studio 2. The engineers were worried she might get a shock off one of the electrical cables. She never did, and to the sadness of the engineers, he never brought her back into the studio again. Next, they recorded John's song Glass Onion. He wrote it for those who dissected the Beatles' lyrics for hidden messages. They worked on the song for 4 days. John played his acoustic Gibson and Ringo's new Ludwig Hollywood kit arrives. After that, they begin recording Paul's ballad I Will. The latter was completed the next day. At this time, the classic rock and roll film The Girl Can't Help It is having its first British TV transmission on BBC Two. Producer Chris Thomas suggests they start the session early as the film starts at around 9 PM. Paul rushes so quickly he has written the whole of the song Birthday by the time the others arrive in the studio. The song is recorded by 8:30. They walk over to Paul's St John's Wood home, which is just a short walk away, and come back after to finish off the song. The next day, they begin work on George's third song, Piggies. A harpsichord had been left in Studio 1, set up for a classical recording. George liked the idea of using it for the song, so they moved their equipment over from Studio 2. While they're working on Piggies, George begins playing an early version of something. Thomas states, "That's great, why don't we do that one instead?" But George isn't interested, so they carry on with Piggies. Side note, another engineer recalls Paul playing and recording an early demo of The Long and Winding Road at this time. September 23rd, recording begins on John's song Happiness is a Warm Gun. It was in fact 3 separate songs woven together. Paul later stated, "It's very similar to Bungalow Bill in that it's a piss take of all the people who really do think happiness is a warm gun. There's a great vocal on it, good lyrics, and it's a very interesting song because it changes tempo a lot. It's quite a complex piece, it's very Lennon." The next day, work continued on the song with John using a picking technique that he learned from Donovan. His fingers began to blister and he told the others, when his hands start to burn, he won't be able to play anymore. Following this, it's decided the group need a change of scenery. They move to Trident Studios and begin recording. While in the studio, John plays a jazz solo for the song. George later complimented him, stating it was brilliant. The next day on the 3rd of October, they begin recording George's 4th song, Savoy Truffle. He'd taken the title from a chocolate box. He later said it was about Eric Clapton's chocolate addiction. The next day, Paul began recording his one-man composition Martha My Dear. Contrary to popular belief, it's not actually about his sheepdog. Paul worked on the song for days and George began his 5th and final song, Long Long Long. George was in a good mood by this point, though the engineers hated the smell of his joss sticks. In the studio, he'd burned several at once. An engineer later stated he'd never smelled joss sticks quite like the ones George burned. George had stated they're from Rishikesh, specially brought in. One of the engineers, Alan Brown, took a joss stick home after a session and kept it for decades in its original wrapping. At the same time, John began recording I'm So Tired and Paul finished off the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. Following this, they finished off Yeah Blues and Why Don't We Do It in the Road. October 13th, the final song for the White Album, John Lennon's Julia, is recorded. Julia is a song that includes messages to both his mother and Yoko intertwined. When all is complete, the Beatles mix the album in their first and only 24-hour session. When everything is complete, George Martin still isn't too happy with what they have. Some of the songs he feels weren't worthy and he never liked the idea of a double album. When the group had returned from India, they had had 32 songs and insisted they all be recorded. they ignored George's idea of concentrating on 16 of the best. George Martin also suspected they were attempting to end their contract with EMI, which required a certain amount of songs. This was a contract they had signed while Brian Epstein was alive. The album divided fans who waited anxiously to see the Beatles' new sleeve. With a vision of Sgt. Pepper, they were met with a blank white cover with a serial number and the Beatles' name embedded. It was in fact a deliberate contrast to Pepper. It was also a nod to the raw production contrast to their previous efforts. Inside, the sleeve featured a photo collage of each 4 Beatles with separate posters and one large poster collage. When all was said and done, John blamed the bad atmosphere on Abbey Road Studios, stating, "It's just working in this shithole of a place." Indeed, Abbey Road had become a fishbowl for the group by this point. They couldn't step outside with journalists waiting with cameras, and they were mobbed in the canteen. If they were prisoners of their own fame, then Abbey Road was their prison. They were now sure their next studio, being designed by Magic Alex Mardas, would be the answer to all their problems. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated, as this is my main source of income. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and however much you wish to donate. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for my next video.